luncheon last week, so I'll do likewise. It was Mr. Jefferson who said, "I never consider a difference of opinion in politics, in religion, or in philosophy as cause for withdrawing from a friend." I echo that sentiment, Mr. Speaker. Though there will be times, like today, when the cut and thrust of policies, we will debate and argue fiercely in this House and in this Parliament and outside of it. I trust we will both be doing so for the country's benefit. The desire to achieve what is best for these Cayman Islands will continue to unite us through the months and years ahead, even if we may at times disagree over how to achieve that desire. We on this side understand that even when elected together on a common platform and common purpose, there will always be challenges. But that common platform and purpose usually brings heads together, and through collaboration, there is resolution. I hope, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the country and the benefit of my friend, the Premier, that despite the rumors that abound about the divisions in the government, that they are indeed just rumors. And the Premier has been able to bring his team together to achieve the same level of unity and ability to deliver for the benefit of the country as the two progressive governments did. Time will tell us. And so much for reflection. Now to continue with the business before us, Mr. Speaker. First, I offer my thanks this afternoon to the Honourable Premier and his Finance Minister for their speeches and the delivery of the Strategic Policy Statement. It was good for the country to hear, at long last, what the Premier and his government think about our island's future and how his packed government will address the challenges and opportunities that the future will bring, particularly regarding the reopening of our borders to tourism. I say at long last, Mr. Speaker, because of course it has been 3 long months since this government took office, during which time the country has been left mainly in limbo, if not adrift. I appreciate that the Premier and his packed government needed to go on team-building exercises to create their policy ideas, make decisions, and find a cohesiveness and bring them all together. But, Mr. Speaker, the issues facing Cayman are immediate and pressing, not least the question of opening our borders and getting all parts of our economy growing once again. In looking to form a government, one would have thought that the critical matters of state would have been front of mind for the Premier and those closest. The Premier noticed shortly after the election that he and his colleagues, and I quote, chose to focus on the 95% that we have in common and ignore the 5% in respect of which we differed. We chose to focus on what united us as opposed to what divided us. That is laudable. But it would seem to us, from those of us looking on the outside, Mr. Speaker, it appears that the 95% they had in common did not amount to much, given the time it took them to say what their collective plans are. And even then, not so much has been said here today. But let me be kind, Mr. Speaker, and note that perhaps what is important is that they seem to have gotten there, and with some semblance of policies and a direction. By contrast, Mr. Speaker, as I indicated before, in 2013, the newly sworn-in government was able to present an interim budget in short order, and we were able to go to the UK to provide them with a credible plan to recover government's finances and reboot the economy following the recession. Mr. Speaker, I have heard some on the government benches saying that the country needed new leadership following the election.
Honourable Member.
Yes, sir.
You just mentioned a date. What date was that?
2013.
2013.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I've heard some on the government benches saying that the country needed new leadership following the election. That is their view. But others, and many others, would disagree. I've come to realize is just how many people and members of the Caymanian public believe that over their last 3 months, there has been a remarkable absence of leadership. What we have had for the most part is a lot of silence. But occasionally, Mr. Speaker, the silence has been punctuated by an announcement the government was cancelling something. First, we had the cancelling of the much-used and much-loved Georgetown shuttle bus. That decision was taken despite the figures demonstrating that the service had grown significantly and it was being used by over 1,000 passengers a week. It was a program that we on this side had plans to continue. And our plans also included moving to electric buses as soon as we could. For all the rhetoric about the environmental credentials, Mr. Speaker, one of the first acts was to cancel a public transport initiative that was contributing to carbon reduction and helping make the shift to a more environmentally sustainable form of transport. Many individuals, including civil servants, left their cars parked, used a convenient free bus shuttle for trips to the banks, credit union, supermarket, hospital, and many stops in between. I had occasion to use it on several times. It helped the public gain confidence in public transport around town. It also relied upon by many older persons in the community who did not have their own vehicle. People, and will not make the transition to give up their cars and use public transport if they cannot rely on the public transport options being maintained. In our view, Mr. Speaker, the government's decision was short-sighted, and I noticed that nothing is said in the SPS today about reinstating it. It's a shame. Next, Mr. Speaker, the country was treated to the Honourable Minister for Agriculture announcing that he was cancelling the Farmers Assistance Programme for a certain segment of it, 1 week after praising it and promising his colleague, the Education Minister, who started the programme, that it would be kept. I remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that the programme was assisting some 1,200 people in the agricultural sector, including backyard farmers licensed by the Department of Agriculture. If there were deficiencies in the programme, it would have been preferable to fix them rather than to cancel the programme outright. But again, we don't see anything in this SPS about encouraging farming. Finally, the Honourable Minister for Tourism and Transport announced that he would be cutting in half the tourism workers' stipend starting in November. I was really pleased to see that they have agreed to continue it. But, Mr. Speaker, not to be outdone by the Grinch, the Minister and the PAC government are in effect cancelling Christmas for the more than 3,000 tourism workers and their families who rely on the stipend. Our hard-hit tourism workers can determine for themselves whether the pact indeed is as people-driven as they say they are. 3 announcements. 3 cancellations of things the previous government was doing that really made a big, tangible difference in the lives of everyday Caymanians. Service that provided over 1,000 bus journeys a week, cancelled. Assistance for people in agriculture, cancelled. Stipends being slashed for 3,000 tourism workers, not cancelled, but certainly of significant negative influence and effect on those affected. And, Mr. Speaker, as we prepare for the eventual return of tourists, the planned roadworks for the West Bay Road, our main tourism area, were stopped. So too was the planned work for the first phase of the long-awaited Airport Connector Road between Estella Tibbetts Highway and the Sparky Drive. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I am hearing that this long-needed connector road is also now being cancelled. I hope I'm wrong. But improving our road network is one of the vital infrastructure developments that will support future economic growth, Mr. Speaker. Now that, too, has moved on to this government's lists of cancellations. Even with its few actions, the PAC government has managed to win itself a reputation for failure when it comes to do things that really matter to average Caymanians. In the interest of balance, Mr. Speaker, I must give the Premier due credit for a positive announcement he made. He announced a few weeks ago that he wants to see more diversity in Cayman's public boards. I welcome it, Mr. Speaker. There is no detail in the press release issued by the Premier on just how he intended to achieve it, nor did he give any details when he referred to the measure at the Chamber luncheon. But details matter, Mr. Speaker. Announcements of changes are one thing. Making change happen is the more difficult part. I would counsel the Premier that when we were in government, we found that the critical issue in respect of the makeup of public boards was how to stimulate more diversity among those willing to serve rather than in the appointment process itself. I believe that he understands this very well. So hopefully we can work together to improve diversity in decision-making across our islands. We will support initiatives governments take to stimulate greater interest among underrepresented groups about serving on public boards. Before I move on, I want to take a moment to welcome those new board member appointments who have agreed to give up their time to serve their country. I also want to thank those members of outgoing boards who agreed to serve and stepped up when they were asked to. The work that they did do as a board member is often underappreciated and misunderstood by many in the public and the media, yet they still agree to serve. We thank you, and the country thanks you for your contribution to the advancement of our beloved islands. And while I welcome the initiative to improve diversity on public boards, Mr. Speaker, I just have to question whether that issue whether that was the issue at the top of the list of concerns that the public was expecting a new government to address. I would suggest that some folks would have suggested one or two more pressing priorities that the government might have turned attention towards. We in the opposition have said that we do understand that the lack of experience in the current government will hamper things getting done. That is inevitable, Mr. Speaker, even if it is undesirable. We have also said that we hope that the experience and expertise of our professional and dedicated civil servants would help to make up for the lack of experience amongst the elected government. On this side of the House, we understand just how important the support and advice of civil servants are for sound decision-making in government. Mr. Speaker, in the April elections, the Progressives-led Alliance put forward a comprehensive vision for the next 4 years, backed up by detailed commitments to deliver the country's priorities. Our plan for a stronger, safer future demonstrated how we could build on our successful track record in government. It set out a plan that could deliver a return to prosperity and make a difference in the everyday lives of Caymanians. That plan was the basis upon which every member on this side of Parliament stood last April and was re-elected. We owe it to those thousands who voted for that plan. We owe it to the country to advocate for what we know to be correct actions for the government now to take. And we will do so in this House and outside of it. As we know, Mr. Speaker, the single biggest issue that the government needs to grapple with is the reopening of Cayman's economy and the need to find a safe and secure path back to success for Cayman's tourism. Linked to this, in our view, is to get to at least 75% of our people vaccinated for a safe reopening. I note that in announcing what he called a reopening plan to the Chamber last week, the Premier used a vaccination target of 80%. That after having already revised up the population estimate by some 6,000 people. So the government now wants a higher proportion of a higher population to be vaccinated before reopening. Mr. Speaker, without further information, this looks suspiciously like the means to excuse the delays in setting a realistic target that will take longer to achieve. If indeed at this rate it is even achievable, I have doubts about the population figures of 71,100 persons
Point
that
of
the
order, Mr.
government
Speaker.
now claims. Pardon, sir?
The Honorable Finance Minister has risen on a point of order.
Okay.
What is the point of order?
Mr. Speaker, the revised population number was provided by the Economics and Statistics Office, the very same competent ESO that the minister relied on when he was there, and that's the same thing that this government relying on while we're here. So there's no political interference in numbers. Those numbers came from Economics and Statistics Office. And as a matter of thing, I would just ask that the memo that was sent to us be forwarded to the Leader of the Opposition also, so you can see exactly, you can get the same information that we got.
I think he's offering you some information.
Mr. Speaker, I understand. The government did not, from when they were talking of it, did not originally, did not say where how the data was derived. But let me finish what I have to say, because I think I will provide the clarity as well. Okay, because I know where we on the government side got our figures from when we were using the $65,000, 65,000 and change in terms of the population. And that was from the labor force survey that was done in the fall of 2020, and it was published in March of 2021. And I can give you the page here, Mr. Speaker, and I read verbatim: for the calendar year ending December 2020.
If you're going to read something, can I have a copy of it?
Yes, sir. The estimated population of
Before you read it. We'll get a copy. Please continue. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, the document says very plainly on page 10 of it that the population of the Cayman Islands was estimated at the end of December 2020, was estimated at 65,786 persons. And that was the basis upon which we used in terms of our calculations for for the data. I don't see the 71,100 population that the Minister for Finance has told me came from the ESO. I went on their website, I looked for this information. It doesn't exist there, that I can tell. Someone needs to explain to me. And that's why I look at it with a bit of skepticism. But what I do know, Mr. Speaker, is that in making this increase, they have now given the country a huge hill to climb. And in so doing, have likely created a near impossible goal to get to 80% of a vaccinated, particularly if you're unable to vaccinate children under the age of 12, who comprise a very significant portion of the population. And additionally, with no clear date to open, many people are not going to get motivated to get themselves vaccinated. I hear it all the time. I hear it almost every day of my life, Mr. Speaker. I'm under no rush to go. They don't have a date to open. I'll go when they tell me when I have to. That's the one way in which we can really get the numbers up to where we need to get them, is when there is a deadline and people are forced to make that choice. But in addition to, Mr. Speaker, there are many Caymanians alike who have said quite openly they're not going to take the vaccine. So you have elements there of people of our population who are resistant and resisting. And I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, as a country, we cannot be held hostage to those. In the end, Mr. Speaker, this is not just a numbers game. It's about having a safe and credible plan, whatever threshold number is used. We in the opposition have been pushing the government to come out with such a plan. And so last month, we urged the government to give notice of a September opening date, to provide local businesses sufficient time to plan to welcome guests properly after some 18 months of borders being closed to tourists. We said at the time that such a reopening plan, in our view, should include a published date of September 1st for reopening. Tourists and residents arriving, these are the headline things that we suggested. Tourists and residents arriving to Cayman Islands on or after that date with proof they had been fully vaccinated with guidelines set by the public health will be able to land without the need to quarantine. Public health would need to advise on what testing requirements would be required for fully vaccinated people, and unvaccinated tourists and residents would still be required to quarantine for up to 14 days. As we noted last month, a September opening date provided time for vaccinations here and in the US to continue and increase significantly. It also allowed our tourism businesses and government entities to prepare to accept tourists again, including hotels hiring Caymanian staff. And it would have enabled airlines time to schedule flights. Of course, after the border opening, our COVID-19 vaccination program will continue to vaccinate even more people locally. Now, I understand, and I've heard with the Premier as well, Mr. Speaker, say that they want to be able to verify that people have had, safely verify that people have been vaccinated. But the real problem you have is in the United States. We know that. But the truth of the matter is, within the United States, you are not going to get to the point where you can have the program of independently and judiciously verifying people's vaccination status, because in some states, particularly a lot of the states where our tourists come from, Mr. Speaker, the Republican governors, they won't let them do it. They cannot even ask. And so my point, Mr. Speaker, is we are making it more difficult for ourselves in terms of achieving any semblance of reopening of our economy. We know that neither stayover nor cruise tourism will get back to 2019 numbers overnight. However, as we have said, the government now needs to set the stage for a tourism recovery while assisting unemployed tourism workers. The government cannot continue with an absence on leadership on this and related issues that require urgent attention and a rethink of the decisions that have been made. It was our submission to the government and the country last month. Of course, a defined reopening date would also have provided the necessary signal to our local population that there was a deadline we are working towards and would have encouraged more to take up the vaccinations. The approach to reopening outlined by the Premier last week, in our view, really doesn't give us the type of plan and confidence that is needed. It is very difficult to rely on anything in there when you have such high thresholds that you have to achieve. At the very best, what it is a list of dates, themselves provisional, with changes to quarantine and vaccination requirements that might come into being. There is no certainty on how thresholds will be achieved or how reopening will be properly planned and implemented. And so, Mr. Speaker, I fear, as I said just now, that the public will likely follow the government's lead and will also wax and wane regarding getting vaccinated. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, it seems to me improbable that the government will even hit their 80% local vaccination trigger or even begin what they term the limited introduction of tourism on September 9th. The numbers that we have to achieve in the remaining weeks are quite significant. So how then can our tourism businesses truly plan, Mr. Speaker, when there is doubt as to what will actually happen? How can our airline partners plan without some kind of committed opening date? They tell us they need 6 to 8 weeks in order to get a schedule of flights into this country. Even if we are able to meet the 80% vaccination rate, we don't know at this point how many tourists will be allowed to land every day or every week as part of the limited introduction of tourists. Airlines need to know this information, Mr. Speaker, to determine how many flights they can do on what days, if any at all. And Mr. Speaker, what's disappointing is that the full welcome back for tourism is scheduled for January 27th next year. And according to the document that I saw, it is an assessment date. So in reality, We really don't have, at this point, a firm date for reopening. Just to illustrate further, Mr. Speaker, it appears that they are not even contemplating a proper return to stayover tourism until next January. No cruise visitors will be returning anytime soon. At best, we can expect a very limited numbers of tourists from time to time, from sometime in September, if an ambitious vaccination threshold is reached. Yet, we heard the Minister for Tourism several weeks ago announce a cut in the stipend for over 3,000 tourism workers on the basis that tourists will be back and creating sufficient work from November. None of this, Mr. Speaker, makes sense to me at all. And I may have missed something publicly, but I'm not aware so. I suspect it makes no sense to people outside of this Parliament either. Mr. Speaker, we on this side are convinced that unnecessary harm continues to be inflicted upon our essential tourism business sector and to the wider country. Mr. Speaker, I suspect that you also hear a lot of these complaints in your constituency, given the number of people who are out of work and unable to make an honest living.
You
For a
know,
plan
you know
to be
that
credible.
you have said that I cannot speak, but I didn't get those kind of complaints.
For a plan to be credible, it needs to set out the detail on how the changes will be managed. So despite whether we believe their reopening timetable is achievable or not, the next outstanding question is what can we glean on how they would go about rebooting our tourism product? What strategy did they set out in the SPS ready to implement for supporting the opening of Cayman's tourism industry? The answer is, Mr. Speaker, very little of substance, let alone present a clear plan for its recovery. Not one single plausible word for the future of stayover tourism. In this case, Mr. Speaker, the Premier noted that the Minister of Tourism brings energy. I have to second him on that one. But sadly, we are discovering that there is no substitute for knowledge, experience, commercial know-how, and strong local and international networks like our last minister had. Mr. Speaker, I urge the minister and the government to have a close look at the road back to 500,000 air arrival strategic tourism plan. That was started by the member for Cayman Brac, West and Little Cayman when he was the tourism minister. That plan will probably now need to be updated, but it is a good place for them to start considering the recovery of tourism and developing a credible and coherent plan. Neither did he make any mention about what shape cruise tourism would take in the future. Nothing said. We advocated following the election that it would be essential to have a national discussion on the future of cruise tourism that could help guide the restarting of this important sector. I was delighted to hear this morning that they appear to accept that and move forward. We really have an opportunity here in relation to cruise tourism to reset the bar and to define what it is that we really want for that industry. I think the country is expecting that from us. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give credit where credit is due, and I've said I've applauded his decision to bring diversity to Cayman's boards. And I recommend, while the diversity is welcome, really, I would have rather seen him announce a real plan for bringing back prosperity to the country. It really is affecting business confidence in a bad way, not just for our hotels, not just for our tourism product, but our restaurant industry. They are hanging on by a thread. That's the reality of the situation. They have borrowed money to help them through, but they are now exhausted. Those borrowings now have to be repaid, and yet still, for the majority of them, they are really only operating at maybe 10, 20% level in terms of it. You've got a couple that are really doing well. They are the most popular ones on the island. But many, many are in dire straits. And we need to find a way. We're now with 16 months into this pandemic that this segment of our economy has been closed. Who in the world can survive? It's a miracle that many have survived that long. And so I know that there will be some sectors today, like financial services, that will welcome some of the initiatives that are mentioned here. Even they, however, will need to see more detail when they can have any real confidence. But as I have noted, the tourism sector will not likely think these so-called strategic policies providing much optimism for the next tourism season. You only have to look at the report today in the Compass of the response from CITA with regard to the reopening plan. Many of the things I have here are the things that they are criticizing and saying they lack. They're no further ahead than they were 2 months ago. Now, Mr. Speaker, we understand that in the ordinary course of government business, the SPS is just a statement of direction rather than a detailed program. That program is going to come later in the formal budget proposals brought before the House later in the year. We also understand very well that not every decision taken in the run-up to an SPS will survive the budget process later in the year. And so it is important to have sufficient meat on the bone of the SPS to make it credible and better aid in the budget preparation process later in the year. Mr. Speaker, I have to be honest and say we on the opposition benches expected more than what we have heard today from the Premier and Finance Minister. When he was Premier, the member for Red Bay, along with me as the Finance Minister, used the opportunity of the SPS statement to put rather more flesh on the bones of government's plans than we have heard today. We understood that it was an important opportunity to do more than just comply with the law in terms of tabling something in the House. The former Premier and our government used the SPS as an opportunity to communicate with the country outside of this place. We understood the importance of giving clarity and certainty to the country and direction to the government, so that when the detailed programs were drawn up, they could be seen as the implementation of the government's declared intent. Mr. Speaker, I probably will be accused this afternoon of being overly critical. It might be suggested that I should cut the new Premier and his government a little more slack. I acknowledge that we recognize they are new to this. But the challenges facing the country are too significant for us to just sit around before they can agree on the real priorities, particularly in terms of our reopening and real solutions. So I am being a bit critical. I understand. But I want to make one thing abundantly clear to everyone in this House today. We on this side of the House have no interest in seeing your government fail. We cannot afford this. However, we do see some real risks. And we all share a responsibility to avoid that possibility actually happening. Therefore, throughout the debate on this SPS, the opposition will offer additional suggestions for action that we hope might help to guide ministers in getting to grips with what actually needs to be done. Most of our suggestions are developed out of the plans we set out in our election manifesto. First and foremost and obvious, we think they are the right plans. However, we also put them forward now because, as the re-election of so many of us showed, they are plans that we believe have widespread support in the community. And so I urge those occupying the government benches to listen closely to what my colleagues say during this debate. It is our job as the opposition to oppose. But it is also right in these circumstances that we offer solutions, not just criticism. I hope that in the same spirit, ministers will accept that what are well thought through set of plans rather than rejecting them just because they have come from these benches. And so, in the spirit of offering constructive remarks during this debate, let me suggest 3 overriding priorities that the government should focus on trying to achieve. First is to restore the Cayman to its path of sustainable, long-term economic growth. Meeting the immediate challenge of opening up our economy is but one step on that path, Mr. Speaker. Yet, faced with the challenge of taking that first step, it seems that the government is faltering. The country needs and deserves more than just suggested dates that are hedged by caveats. It needs clarity and a government that can be trusted to ensure that whatever the date is that is finally selected, the process will be properly and safely managed and executed. Even today, we have not heard the clarity that really is needed, nor do we get the sense of conviction that would reassure us on the opposition benches and the wider public that they are getting this right. Trust in our government. Although the last government, to do the right things for Cayman, was hard-won over the last 18 months. The government can benefit from that trust if they will act and listen. And even as we plan for and take the first step to open Cayman, Mr. Speaker, the government should be thinking about the longer term. The second priority, Mr. Speaker, is to get the balance right between accommodating growth and protecting Cayman's precious environment. This presents a challenge for all of us, and I suspect that is particularly so in a government containing such diverse views on how such a balance should be struck. And it does not help, Mr. Speaker, when one of the government ministers has already set off on the wrong direction, cancelling the Georgetown shuttle bus service instead of using the program to promote the switch to sustainable transport. I urge the government to bring forward plans for a future public transport solution for these islands at the earliest opportunity. They will not have to look far, as the work was already started under the member for Georgetown North when he was minister. He had previously told this House that he had asked his ministry to proceed with procuring expertise in public transport to recommend the best options for us to consider. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, our 2020-2021 SPS noted that government will commission a specialist mass transportation study to analyze the options available for us to achieve the necessary step change in public transport that the country needs. Like many things, Mr. Speaker, these plans were hampered by COVID, but the ministry was preparing to come forward following the election. So I urge the government to ignore where the plans came from, but instead, let's just move forward. Let's see what are the best long-term options for us, rather than trying some band-aid approach. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the sentiments expressed by the Premier about the need to preserve Cayman's precious environment. But as I have said, Mr. Speaker, sentiment is not enough. We need to know what action the new government intends to take. I hope at least on this issue, the government can try to build on the strong position that the last administration left for them, as well as advancing the marine parks and other conservation initiatives The government did, at last, solve the most pressing environmental problem facing the country by completing the work to put in place a sustainable waste management solution that meets the current needs, our country's needs for decades ahead. And I notice, Mr. Speaker, that any mention of the project was conspicuously absent from the speeches today. Mr. Speaker, I hope you'll forgive me if I pause here to put on record the thanks of everyone on the opposition benches, and I hope I can speak for the whole House too. I know I can. To give our thanks for the services done for the Cayman by Mr. Peter Ranger, who sadly passed away in May. As project manager for what is now the Regen project, Mr. Ranger provided much needed expertise to my colleague, the then Minister for Environment, in getting the contract with DECO over the line. On behalf of us all, I extend our deepest sympathies to his family and to his colleagues, who I know are still mourning his sad loss. The project is an extremely complex one, but much of the heavy lifting has already been done, and we are very close to solving a problem that has been around for decades. Let us get this done, Premier. Let's truly close the landfill and once and for all, and provide a modern waste management facility that will also feed our energy grid. One of the fallacies, Mr. Speaker, that continues to be trotted out in the debate over Cayman's future is that there is somehow a choice between development and protecting the environment. There is not. The choice is not a binary one. Not least because, as the Regen project demonstrates, is that development is often the way to solve environmental problems. I hope it is not being mentioned, by it not being mentioned once today so far, that this does not indicate that the project will be stopped. The question is not whether we need development, but what type. And what type of development we need and where it should be located. Answering that question and getting the balance right requires long-term sustainability planning, and I welcome what the Premier has said about the Pact's government intention to produce a new development plan. Again, though, we need to see the details of the review that the Premier said he will begin. There is an obvious place to start, and that is with the Plan Cayman approach pioneered by the last administration. The extensive consultations we carried out on the shape of the future development for our islands provides a platform for the government to build upon and complete the project. Continuing that approach represents the best opportunity to have a long-term development plan that will be refreshed on a regular basis. It is a logical and sensible approach to a national need that has evaded several governments since the last attempt in the early 2000s. Hopefully, the Plan Cayman approach and the work completed today will not be cancelled by the government, as an online media site has recently suggested might occur. If it is cancelled, Mr. Speaker, then I fear that the government should expect the same result as all governments since the plan was last updated in 1997. Returning to the environment for a minute, Mr. Speaker, I must say that we share the Premier's concern for climate change, perhaps, though we differ on where the real effort of government should be spent. It is important that we play our part in reducing our carbon footprint, and certainly Regen will assist in this. Page 10 of our manifesto contains some 17 proposals to help address the risk of climate change, including updating our climate change strategy to take on board the results of the technical assistance and advice from the UK on climate change risk mapping and mitigation. This work on climate risk mapping was agreed by our government, and I am pleased that the work will be started by the UK and the results made available to us. Whilst a country like the Cayman Islands does not contribute to the global climate change in any truly significant way, we are significantly affected by it. And so the risk mapping and mitigation must be the main area of focus for us. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't mean there are things that we can do. And we must look to do and play our part in reducing the effects of this climate change. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the third national policy should be to continue the improvements in Cayman's public schools. I must say that I regret the decision taken by the Honourable Minister for Education to join the government. But if there is a positive upside, it is that she stands as a beacon of competence and reassurance in the government. She has been there for now 4 years, and she was the architect, one of the architects of the education change programs that has seen public schools and student attainment improving throughout government schools. She understands what it will take to drive further success. I know she has the plans on her desk, and I hope that she has been able to persuade her new colleagues to back her plans and give her the resources she needs to see the job through. Not a lot was said about this today, but I trust that the government will see the recent improvements in education and to continue with the plans that got us there. I welcome the Premier's remarks about the benefit of having the Minister of Education continue in the role to ensure that there can be continuity. I therefore have hope that the education reforms already started will not be cancelled, but they will continue and that they will bear much fruit. That said, Mr. Speaker, I joined with my colleague for Georgetown South, the opposition spokesman for education, when she recently congratulated and thanked the Minister for continuing a program of enhanced scholarships, especially for those young Caymanians going into teaching. I say continuing because the enhanced scholarship programs were started and agreed when we were in government before the general elections. What will be important now, Mr. Speaker, is that we do not put many obstacles and hurdles in front of students and their parents that will hinder quality candidates from applying for the scholarships. Minister will remember that this too was an issue that we discussed when continuing these scholarships. I was pleased to hear this Premier speak to affordable housing at the Chamber Legislative Luncheon, and again today, Mr. Speaker. It is an area that we can probably support the government on. Indeed, in our manifesto, we had highlighted the following initiatives as needed: to appoint a parliamentary secretary to assist the minister responsible for housing, to ensure that there is a sustained focus on new and innovative affordable housing initiatives, and to promote the available programs. It would also give it the right visibility within the government. Secondly, to develop more affordable home rentals and home ownership schemes alongside that of the National Housing Development Trust. This can be done by incentivizing private sector developers to cater to these markets, including social landlords in the rental market. We propose to increase the first-time Caymanian homeowners threshold to allow homes costing up to $500,000 to be purchased duty-free, and amounts above that to be charged 2% duty. Land to build a home on up to $150,000 would also be available duty-free for first-time Caymanian purchasers. We would also sought to introduce, with local banking participation, an updated government guarantee home assistance mortgage scheme, or GGHAM as we know it, and to promote a build on your own land scheme. The GGHAM program, Mr. Speaker, has been one of the most successful programs that the government has had in terms of assisting Caymanians to be able to acquire a home where they otherwise would not qualify had they just gone straight to the banks themselves. And what has happened over the years of the GGHAM, Mr. Speaker, is that yes, there have been defaults. Yes, there have been situations where the government guarantee has been called by the banks. But what is happening in those cases, Mr. Speaker, is that the experience on that program is no worse than what the commercial banks are experiencing. And that was the intent. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, we sought to ensure all new NHDT homes are built to accommodate solar energy to reduce electricity costs for homeowners. It is not just on affordable housing that action is needed. Mr. Speaker, there are a host of other initiatives that we believe are necessary, but not much has been said today on what government actually intends to do. I'll only point to a few things. We need to look at more affordable public options for health insurance, home insurance, and pension plans that can exist alongside those offered by the private sector. This was mentioned at the issues with health insurance, pensions, was mentioned by the Chamber last week as some of the most pressing issues currently impacting the private sector, Mr. Speaker. We were ready to take action. I would also urge the Premier to accelerate action to complete two important pieces of work that our administration was working on, Mr. Speaker. First, the government must complete the minimum wage review over this year and seek to establish the level as is necessary to ensure that it meets and continues to meet the objectives for which it was established. Secondly, I urge the government to complete the review of the Customs Tariff Act and seek to remove import duties from necessary products such as medications, disposable diapers, processed baby foods, feminine products, birth control products. And in addition, we need to look again and take a holistic look at the reductions on food products with import duties. That, Mr. Speaker, can make a real impact on the lives of every Caymanian in this country. Mr. Speaker, I was also pleased this morning to no end to hear about the government initiative on ensuring no child in school goes hungry. We also welcome the steps to increase assisted living. However, for both of these initiatives, there was nothing said about what actions will be taken, but I hope that once these are understood, we will be in a position to support these as well. On the face of it, they are good programs. Let's see the details. Mr. Speaker, we have again recently seen a spate of gun crime in the community. We worked hard in government to provide the RCIPS with the means to tackle gun crimes and indeed all crimes, to ensure the safety of our islands. I am hoping that the government will continue this support and support the various interventions that seek to prevent crime, especially gang-related crime. As I indicated in my statement last week, all gun crimes are concerning, but the recent ones we have witnessed are particularly ruthless, especially considering that it was the use of a lethal automatic weapon to shoot indiscriminately in public places. This type of crime is not something we are used to seeing, nor is it something that should ever become the norm in our society. As I had indicated last week, the opposition fully supports the measures agreed to address these deeply disturbing gun crimes decisively. And I acknowledge, as a member of the National Security Council, the decision taken there last week. But other things may be needed, and we really need to put our collective heads together on this. Some have called for a gun amnesty through form and timing, though form and timing of any such amnesty will need to be carefully considered to increase its effectiveness. I again stand here today and encourage the community at large. You all need to do your part. Government, the police, this parliament. We can't succeed without the support of the community in trying to get these guns off the street and to curb the serious spate of crime that is starting to surface again. We must ensure that the evil of gun and gang culture is not left to fester, and it must be curtailed. Strong policing is only a part of the solution. It is not the only solution. What is also needed over the medium to long term is to move forward with the work on the anti-gang strategy that was started under the last administration and announcing this SPS in 2019. It is important that we actively divert at-risk young people away from crime and from gangs and help them find their way to being productive citizens. I urge the government today to commit to carrying this important work forward. We also need to look again at the link between the legal numbers games and criminality in general. Work was to have started on increasing the penalty for those involved with illegal numbers or other forms of gambling. And so the government should get that work completed or explain to the country what alternative actions it proposes to break the link between gambling and other forms of criminality. Mr. Speaker, we can all see that the plague of gangs and guns and violence is impacting our lives across the country. We in the opposition will keep pressing the government to answer that vital question. What are we going to do to tackle it? On a more positive note, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that our team of young Olympians have been selected, and with the support of government will be traveling to the Olympic Games in Japan next month. I am sure today that the member for Georgetown West is also happy to see this, given his involvement as Parliamentary Secretary to the Sports Ministry during the last term. On behalf of the opposition, I want to wish them well. We're proud of them, and we are all going to be watching them keenly and cheering them on. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues will speak more to these issues, but I thought it useful to mention them here to allow the government the opportunity to provide their thoughts on these important initiatives that are aimed at making our people's lives better. So that brings me on, Mr. Speaker, to some remarks about finance. Across the 8 years of the last two Progressives-led governments, sound finances remained the bedrock of our highly successful approach to government. It also served as the foundation for the confidence of the business sector, a foundation that, together with the right policies, has helped provide the most successful economy that we have seen in decades. Indeed, an economy that economist Marla Dukaran has called the best managed economy in the Caribbean. Let me just remind this Parliament of our track record, Mr. Speaker. Our financial success brought the government into line with the prudential ratios set out in the PMF, in the Public Management and Finance Act. Except for 2020, we delivered year-on-year budget surpluses. We invested in much-needed infrastructure using cash, not borrowing. And we were able to save so that we had resources available to meet the COVID crisis head-on. We significantly reduced the national debt, and even through the crisis, we managed to avoid new borrowing and accessing the line of credit that we put together in late 2019. Across all 8 years, we did not raise fees or duties, and we even, where it was possible, reduced the burden of those fees on both businesses and families. The lesson I would urge government to heed is that we set out our core financial principles right from the start, and we stuck to them. Only when facing the huge challenge of a global pandemic did we depart from that financial strategy. And then when we did, knowing that meeting the needs of our people for immediate relief had to come first. I think everyone in this chamber would accept that in so doing, we did the right thing. Mr. Speaker, we all know the effects of that crisis are still with us. No one in this side of the House expects the government to be able to just simply copy and paste the strategy, our strategy. We accept that the government is starting from a very different position than in 2017. On the other hand, Mr. Speaker, the national finances are in significantly better shape and order than when the 2013 Progressives-led government came to office. In his public announcements since the election, The Minister of Finance has suggested that he was surprised to find that the deficit for 2021 was now forecast to be larger than previously reported. Mr. Speaker, in the SBS before this House today, the number is even higher. And he lamented, Mr. Speaker, that no provision had been made in the pre-election financial forecast for any extension to the tourism stipend. Mr. Speaker, the Minister should know that it is a practice in government to bring revisions in the financial estimates and forecasts back to this House on a regular basis to reflect changes in circumstances or the financial impact of new decisions. There was no decision or policy decision taken and communicated to the government, to the civil service, with regard to the tourism stipend or even a number of those other programs that are ongoing. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the Financial Secretary had rightly not made any provision and not presuppose or anticipate anything without a policy directive. The future of the stipend was a decision for the new government to make. And this PAC government has now made that decision, and I welcome it. But I sure hope they don't really intend to cut the stipend in November without the country being open fully to tourism and people back at work. Mr. Speaker, I need to make this very clear. There can be and should be no suggestion that there was some kind of conspiracy afoot to conceal the size of the deficit. The reason for the increased deficit forecast is that it reflects what I believe are adjustments that needed to be made because of the fact that you were at a year end. They were late adjustments that came into, that needed to be made in government's finances. And the Minister of Finance and his colleagues, they should all be aware of what those adjustments are. They should know. And they too are now in the power and accountable for the decisions that they make. Of more concern to me, Mr. Speaker, has been the Minister's statements that suggested my government may have deliberately misstated the government's 2020 year-end deficit by some $48 million. Today, though, I note it has increased further by another $20 million to $110 million in this document, as I said. I've already addressed this publicly. These changes occurred subsequent to my departure from the ministry, and I do await the Minister's explanation as to what caused these adjustments or the late booking of transactions. But Mr. Speaker, I hope if in his contribution to the debate on the statement made by the Premier, the mover of the motion for, that he will provide an update and let the country know. It's important to me. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister himself has said, the finances, and he said so at the very early days of their government, the finances are in overall good shape considering the impact of the pandemic. There is certainly today no British overseas territory that is in as good position as we are financially. And that speaks volumes about our stewardship of finances and of the pandemic. I would suggest that there are very few countries in the world right now that can boast the sound financial position that we have. Everyone is screaming and borrowing money, extending national debt. And yet still 18 months into this pandemic, we have not had to resort to borrowing one penny. The outstanding success of the two last administrations was to create surpluses that were saved so that Cayman could ride out tough economic times. And that is exactly just what has happened. And today I'll tell you, I am proud of the financial position that we bequeathed to this incoming government. As a past finance minister, Mr. Speaker, I know that the point here today with the SPS is not just the numbers, but the overwhelming need to provide the government and the country with clarity and signal the government's commitment to staying the course. I have heard and seen his figures with regard to the projections and the forecasts that the government will find themselves in compliance, full compliance with the Public Management and Finance Act by end of 2022. That's very laudable, Mr. Speaker. In my time there, in working with the ministry, I know the feeling at that point was that it was going to be very difficult to achieve compliance within the time frame that's set out in the Public Management and Finance Act. That requires a 3-year timetable, but it is possible to extend it. And the advice I gave to the ministry in preparing the documents and in forecasting was that if we cannot make it in the 3-year time frame, we need to be straight up and honest. Say so, and let's propose what the right amount is. But I am glad to see it. It would obviously clear that things have improved if we can get ourselves back into compliance in the 1-year period. And I laud them for that. We remain to see whether that can be achieved. But I have hope. Mr. Speaker, the government's ability to manage its finances efficiently and effectively is not just important in and of itself. As the last 8 years have shown, Mr. Speaker, sound government finances are vital in creating business confidence. As confidence increases, so does business investment. That investment creates new jobs and economic growth. The growth, in turn, creates more government revenues. Those revenues allow the government to invest in public services and at the same time strengthen government's finances. That is the virtuous circle that the progressive-led governments achieved, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister has talked about doing things differently and better. But what was absent was no indications of, or no one has a clear understanding of what that really means. The finance minister started by saying he was working towards a goal of improving fiscal prudence. But, Mr. Speaker, very little in what he said represents an improvement over our strategy when we were in government, except perhaps we delivered compliance with no new borrowing. The government proposed to borrow some $330 million. In other words, they are planning over the next 2 years to draw down fully on the line of credit that we implemented and put in place in 2020. But the government proposes to borrow some $330 million of new borrowing to finance capital that we financed by revenue. I haven't been able to examine the numbers in any detail or to try and tear them apart, Mr. Speaker, to determine if this is truly necessary. However, whether or not you view this as prudent, it is certainly not an improvement on our track record, even during the last year. And with that in mind, there are questions that were unanswered. What is the future strategy on borrowing? Does the government intend to restore revenue financing in the longer term? If so, when? The minister talked about getting Caymanians into work and reducing unemployment by, I think, I'm trying to remember the words he used, in such a way that it would shift labor dynamics. But I'm not sure what that means, as it was not explained. But I look forward to having it explained, along with understanding how it is going to be done and accomplished. Is the minister satisfied that the revenue projections are robust? Given the uncertainty of the so-called reopening plan, there must be risk attached to tourism revenues, and if confidence is hit, then to sectors like construction too. That's only natural. Has the government done any risk assessment on revenue and modeled the impacts? Mr. Speaker, the minister concluded by saying the government had recognized the need for difficult decisions. That is the role of government, Mr. Speaker, and is something that we on this side understand well. There are difficult decisions to make. I encourage them and I implore them, get on with making those decisions and let's move the country forward. Mr. Speaker, in previous public announcements, the finance minister had mentioned millions of dollars of savings within the budget that he was working to achieve. I ask the question today, are they reflected in the SPS? He has not said. And I encourage him and continue to encourage him to provide an answer to the questions from me about the 2020 increased deficit. So what do we on this side think the government needs to address in order to give the country the clarity it needs? To what should this government collectively commit? I think, Mr. Speaker, the government needs to forthrightly address the uncertainty that exists over its approach to meeting the immediate needs of those experiencing economic difficulties. Repetition is often useful, so I'll say it again that Cayman needs a real plan for reopening our borders and for restarting stay-over tourism. Given the importance of financial services, I do hope what has been said here today about supporting this vital economic sector is more than just lip service. It is important that government not only maintain close dialogue with the industry, it also needs to ensure that the country is kept aware as much as is possible on what is happening in the sector and what are government's plans and policies in response to the continuing challenges. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that there is a conference scheduled in January. Not a conference, but meeting scheduled here in January for an insurance captive. Over 1,000 people planning to come. But they are not waffling, they just don't know whether the country is going to be open. That's something that not only affects financial services, but it affects the tourism industry in a very big way. To accommodate that many people in our hotels, they're limited. It takes up a lot of rooms from out of the room stock, out of the hotels that are here and operating on the 7 Mile Beach. They need to know. I note this, Mr. Speaker. Having seen an article in Monday's Cayman Compass that the finance ministers from the group of 20 countries, including the UK, the USA, and the EU, endorsed plans for a new global minimum tax. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, the article went on to mention that the Cayman Islands had joined the agreement. This was also reported in the international press at the start of the month. Yet, we have heard nothing directly from the government on this development and explaining what we have actually joined up to. Or I hope that the government will correct this and advise the country very promptly on what exactly they have agreed to. Government should not be silent on this. Financial services may know that answer, but the rest of the country needs to know. Cayman also needs its agricultural sector to thrive, to ensure ongoing food security and to help counter the high cost of imported food that contributes to increases in the cost of living. Mr. Speaker, every one of us came to appreciate and to really welcome the opportunities we had during the lockdown to buy a lot of goods and food and stuff grown locally in terms of our vegetables, fruit, everything. For the first time in many years, there was an abundance. I think that the PAC government's decision to end the farm subsidy is inexplicable, and really it is not a good decision. Similarly,
The Honorable the Minister of Tourism,
Thank you.
rising on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Repetition, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Leader of Government, Leader of Opposition, has repeated this matter in respect to the farming 3 times so far, I think we get the point, and as a part of our standing orders, repetition is a violation of the standing orders.
Opposition. I think the member, the Minister of Tourism is right. You have repeated it several times. I would hope you are at the end of that repetition, because it's coming to the point where it is tedious.
Mr. Speaker, there shall be no further mention of it. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the government needs to commit clearly to maintaining the program of infrastructure investment started by the Progressives. I fear and I'm concerned that behind the allocations that the Minister has set out today, there lurks a series of reductions in the level of investment that was planned by our government. Across the world, not least in the United States, we are seeing strong governments investing in public infrastructure to maintain economic stimulus that limits the hardship. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the government talk about a number of the projects that they are going to continue and do so. But for the sake of my presentation, I would just point out that in making their commitment to infrastructure investments, Cayman needs, not just for economic stimulus reasons, but also to ensure the long-term health of our economy. These include the completion of the vital infrastructure projects such as the John Gray High School, a new health services facility for Bodden Town, Project Regen, formerly known as the Integrated Solid Waste Management System, the long-term residential mental health facility, and the extension of the East-West Arterial Road to Frank Sound, and other ongoing major road improvements, and support for the plans for the National Housing Development Trust to provide more affordable housing for Caymanians. And of course, in Cayman Brac, the piped water expansion project along the works on the sports complex should continue, whilst the existing garbage dumps on both sister islands should be closed as part of the Regen project. These projects may need to be prioritized and done in phases based on available resources, but they must be done for the benefit of the country. The third element of the financial strategy must address the need to bring our nation's finances back into balance. And they have clearly set out what their expectations and goals are with regard to achieving that in terms of the numbers that they have presented. But really, we need to hear the details of what lie behind the headline allocations and any proposed revenue-raising measures, and potentially the borrowing plans that may need to be put in place. Failing that, Mr. Speaker, at the moment, there are more questions, and I think, than there are answers. And so we look forward and are anticipating that over the next few months, that the government will come together in the preparation of the budget and have a credible document that we can all throw ourselves behind it later on this year. Today was an opportunity for the government, a chance to explain what break the silence first, and then to explain what the next 4 years would look like for Cayman. While we have seen some clarity and achieved some clarity, there is still much left to be said and much to be explained. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, Cayman cannot afford for its government to fail at this crucial time in our history. It is beholden on all of us to do what we can to fill and to help with the ideas at the heart of this packed government and to overcome the dearth, help to assist in giving solution that the SPS process has revealed. I hope that the recommendations and that we have made and that I have made in this response to the policy statement will be taken in good faith, that they will be considered, and that they will be implemented in the coming 2-year budget. Mr. Speaker, we on the opposition benches will do what we can. We only ask that they listen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If no other member wishes to speak, I will call on the Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as it appears no member is willing to speak at this point, perhaps we can call an adjournment of the House for today, and we can come back for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, sir.
The proposal is that the House do now adjourn. I think it is appropriate because it seems like no members are ready to speak, and this is the first time in many, many years that an SPS has been debated. So perhaps members are not prepared. Therefore, let me call on the Honorable the Premier for the motion for adjournment. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to move the adjournment of this honorable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning under the relevant standing orders.
Thank you, Premier. I have been given notice by the Honorable Deputy Governor for an intervention. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I crave your indulgence. I was informed earlier today that Ms. Nellie McCoy, a former civil servant, passed away. And I want to, on behalf of all of us here, record our condolences to the family. Ms. Nellie, as she was affectionately known, worked at MRCU for almost 50 years. And that, I think, is a record across our civil service. She was known to, I think, all of us here. She was a joy to work with. Everyone talked about her, her dedication, her commitment. One of her duties was to count mosquitoes, and to, at a time when mosquitoes were a lot more than what they are today. But what she was able to do to identify the mosquitoes that were harmful to us has got us to where we are today in our fight to control mosquitoes. She was in hospital for quite some time at Health City, and I checked on her from time to time. She was very close to my family. And I just want, on behalf of all of us here, to express our sincere condolences to Ms. Nellie McCoy and her family, and wish them all the very best. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Governor. The question is that this Honorable House do now stand adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. This Honorable House is now adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.